So let's go now to Meg Hansen, and she has a particular issue that she would like to bring to our attention. And as we listen to her, let's think about what questions we might want to ask and how we should learn, how we can learn from her to prepare for the future. Meg Hansen, do we have you on the line?
Hi, Bill. It's great to be here with you.
Well, mighty good to hear your voice. Well, you sent a note. You've done several opinion pieces, and now you're working on podcasts and many other ways of getting the free society approach into the public forum. We're kind of using the old-fashioned way of the radio, but Meg, some of us love that the best. But tell us about this issue of that we're working together with Massachusetts and other states about how to address the energy issue in a way that makes sense, and how some of the ideas that seem good on paper, and you're going to tell us about a prominent one, seem good, have unintended consequences that will hurt unintentionally many of our listeners. Get us started, Meg Hansen.
Thank you, Bill. I have to say, though, that the radio is really, really important. And in the 80s, AM radio was the avenue through which different points of view were introduced to the average American. So, all forms of communication, I would say, are equally important and complement each other. So thank you for doing this show. As far as this issue is concerned, just a little context. When it comes to fuel emission standards, things related to air pollution like tailpipe emissions, states have a choice. We can either follow the federal EPA standards or we can follow California's standards. And 16 states, including Vermont, chose to adopt California's emission standards, which are more stringent than the federal ones. And so in the year 2000, Vermont tied itself to California when it comes to regulations about, like I said, tailpipe emissions, but also something known as zero-emission vehicles, or ZEV vehicles. Mm-hmm. And in the year, so this is sort of the background. We are tied to whatever California does. And in the year 2020, California Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order over the California version of the EPA, so the Californian Air Resources Board. And he said that board, the California board, needs to ban internal combustion engines, so gasoline-powered vehicles, by the year 2035. And because 16 states are tied to California, it has sort of triggered a domino effect whereby this law will also have to take place or have to go into effect in the other 16 states, including Vermont. And so a coalition of think tanks and advocacy groups came together to say this is not right, and we can get into, the reasons why. There's several reasons why. And we had a virtual press conference on last Thursday, where we supplied a letter explaining our stance. And we talked to the media, we answered questions, and we explained why this law automatically taking effect is wrong and how it will really hurt middle-class families and lower-income families in our individual states. And this is very true in New England. As I said, there are 16 states across the nation, but all New England states are tied to the California law except for New Hampshire. So our coalition is sort of really being led by Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut.
Meg Hansen is with us today on Common Sense Radio, and we sure do appreciate her tipping her hat to our preferred way of communication, but we respect all the other ways of communicating too. Contrary to popular belief, Bruce Shields and I were not around at the time that stone tablets were used. We're making our way into the 21st century, but it'll be a little bit of a struggle for us. Today we're talking about the effect of banning internal combustion engines. All of those who are regular listeners of our community on the air will remember that many of us believe that it was the internal combustion engine that in the early 1900s paved the way, perhaps a bad metaphor, opened the door to tremendous improvements in the mobility of the American people and the prosperity that followed from that freedom. And as a matter of fact and as a matter of course, we should also remember that it improved the environment, because what was happening before is that there were enormous amounts of trees being cut down and fields left open to produce the hay for the horses, and also tremendous amounts of pollution in the urban areas of America and throughout the world, where it was hard to dispose of the byproduct of using literal horsepower. So, as always, important questions are complicated. And what Meg's going to help us understand today is that if we try to solve a problem with massive government intervention, more often than not, we create unintended consequences that hurt the very people we're aiming to help. Meg Hansen, keep us going.
So the first issue, which is at a regulatory level, is Vermont is not a colony of California. We have our own elected representatives, as do they. And so this really should be an issue that our legislature and our own regulatory authorities discuss, and Vermonters should have a say in that. So what's really interesting is it's not that the Californian board decided this. It's basically Gavin Newsom issuing an executive order forcing or compelling the board to ban internal combustion engines, and then have 16 other states also follow suit. So it's really one person's point of view, and I think that's something that a lot of people are taking a lot of issue with. Naturally, that's very legitimate, that this should be returned to the states. Nobody wants autopilot laws or regulations. So I think having Vermont decouple itself from California when it comes to this issue especially, and talk about it and have Vermonters have a say, that's the first point that we raised at the press conference and will continue to raise in terms of building awareness about what's going on and informing, Vermonters. And then, of course, we can get into the second aspect, which is, mandating something like a technology ban or a mandate really can't succeed in the absence of affordable alternatives. So any sort of energy source is successful when it is cheap, reliable, and plentiful or abundant. And that's what fossil fuels are, whether it's any form of it, gasoline, diesel, propane. These are reliable sources that are abundant and that are cheap. And that's really, as you said, Bill, it transformed human civilization. When we became, food sufficient, we expanded. It was a whole population boom. We live longer. It completely transformed how human civilization looks and functions. So there's a lot to be grateful for when it comes to fossil fuels. And we don't have to get into, the ideology behind that, but just looking at it practically and pragmatically, if you want to replace or just ban this form of energy, there needs to be an equivalent. There needs to be something that is cheap, abundant, and reliable. And we don't have that. How do we get there? When it comes to zero emission, so when they say zero emission, they mean no carbon emissions, so no fossil fuels. Basically, you don't want to burn that. The most dominant technology available is electric vehicles, which have a battery, an electric battery, and then that's how you get towards zero emission. But at this point, it is not affordable and not readily available. So as far as middle class or lower income families are concerned, it's really out of reach. I want to share a statistic. We know that the government heavily subsidizes electric vehicles, and so you do get, and also you get tax credits for it. But 82% of Americans who took advantage of the government tax credit have six-figure salaries. So this is a huge class divide, whereas Vermont is very rural, and when we look at our socioeconomic divide, the vast majority of Vermonters, this is completely out of our reach. So basically commanding that, just choosing an arbitrary year like 2030 or 2035 and just commanding that we're going to ban the dominant vehicle technology, I don't see how that achieves anything except for political posturing. But what it does is it does hurt middle class and lower income families, it really makes things hard because we have to look at the whole picture. Now, somebody commented on the Ethan Allen Institute website that, right now at face value, what he said was that, sure, an electric vehicle right now costs more than, let's say, various different models of, gasoline-powered vehicles. But he thinks that in the long term it'll get cheaper. It's not just my point to that is it's not just the retail value. We're not talking about a Tesla versus a Toyota. There is a lot that goes into supporting an electric vehicle. It's not just a magic bullet, you just buy it and everything's fine. You have to upgrade your home electric grid. I mean, you're supposed to bring it home and charge it. So there needs to be extra power that you can do that. And how are you going to be able to do that? There are extra costs that go with that. It's not, and it has to be maintained. The battery has to be maintained. You have to know where there are electric charging stations. If it gets too cold or too hot, the battery dies. There are many aspects to that. Never mind what happens to the battery after it's dead. That's another discussion altogether. There are a lot of costs that go into owning, maintaining, and being able to reliably drive an electric vehicle. And all those costs add up.
Today with Meg Hansen, we're taking a look at the question of should, at some point in the future, the use of internal combustion engines fired by fossil fuels, hydrocarbon fuels, be banned. The second one that was mentioned by Meg earlier had to do with the idea of whether states should make their own policies or should they hitch their policies automatically to that of the biggest population state in the country, California. Why should we automatically hitch our policy to that of another state? Meg Hansen, keep us going.
And I think right now we have to consider the fact, or we definitely have to consider the fact, that we are facing record high inflation, record high gas prices. And the idea that our policymakers would try to limit our choices, limit consumer choices, instead of expanding them, I find that worrisome. I think the idea that it really should be, we should be helping Vermonters and Americans expand choices because most of us don't have disposable income to ride inflation waves. And I find it particularly concerning that so many people in positions of power and influence are demanding almost that we, eat the extra price, the gas pump somehow, whether it's $1 or $2 is how they put it, just, stick it to the man or stick it to the Russian man. And that's very worrisome because, unless you have $16 million a year or at least $1 million a year in your annual income, these kinds of questions are really ridiculous. I can just tell you for myself, when I was considering heating oil, how much that would cost, it was about, when we estimated it to do our annual budget, because we put our money aside, it was about, let's say, $100 a month. I'm just saying, for now, for these months, going into April, May, and June. But now we're looking at over $100 a week. It's more than tripled. So that's just heating oil for the home. When you look at gas prices, you get this huge shock every time you go to fill up a tank. And all these things add up. I don't know how much it is, but if it's $5,000 or $6,000 extra a year, most families don't have that. So we're talking about real numbers and the reality and reasoning. And I think that's far more important than ideology or wishful thinking about the future and hoping that somehow by a magic year in the near future, electric vehicle technology will rival that of internal combustion engines. So far, that entire sector has been propped up by government subsidies. We're talking about billions. And yet it doesn't compete. So why not allow that technology the time it needs and the space it needs to evolve? Maybe it'll fail. Maybe another solution will come up. But we can't force something to happen, especially when we look at the record and see that it is not happening. We're not there.
But one of the questions that Meg is raising and asking us to consider is how does, even if this is successful, how does it fall unevenly on people who live in rural areas, which as everybody knows is one of our principal concerns for public policy in Vermont. So give us a couple of questions you'd like us to think about.
Great. My question that I want everybody to think about is, can the New England electric grid handle a massive increase in the demand for electricity that will follow a 100% transition to electric vehicles? Mm-hmm. Because if everybody has an electric vehicle, or the vast majority does, then that is an extreme demand of electricity on our grid. And what are we doing to manage that? Or can we manage that?
Mm-hmm. And what are the other competing public policy goals that we want to achieve? And how will a profound and rapid change in advancing one goal, no matter how well intended, affect the others? Meg, keep us going.
So when Vermont Yankee, our nuclear plant based in Vermont, was shut down, the Boston Globe, which is not a right-wing newspaper by any standard, the Boston Globe editorialized that it would have a negative impact on the New England grid for the foreseeable future. I said earlier that we need cheap, reliable, and abundant energy to fuel or run our civilization. We already know that our electric grid has weaknesses, and if you put more pressure on it, as would happen if we have all electric vehicles or a massive increase in our electricity demand, then what happens? What are the real consequences of that? One that we can expect, because it's happening in other states that have transitioned or are transitioning to a higher demand of electricity on their grid, is planned blackouts. We see in California, where I have a family, they tell me that there are commercials on TV where they say, okay, after 4 p.m., start using less electricity, or there are blackouts. I mean, we're seeing this happen here in the United States, which is a superpower, a first world country. There should be no problems with electricity. But yet we're seeing that because there's only so much that an electric grid can take. So if we want to have a full transition to electric vehicles or any kind of electric society, we need to also have a grid that can support it. So it has to be a holistic approach to that. And you can't get to these questions and you can't get to solutions if you're approaching this issue with a black and white perspective, as in fossil fuels are bad and electric vehicles are good. It's not as simple as that. There are many, many factors that come into it, and we have to take it. As you said, it's very complex, very dynamic. There are many aspects to it. And even when you look at electric vehicles, as I sort of mentioned in passing, the battery, once it's done, how do you recycle it? Is that, you can't, it doesn't go into a normal landfill because it's flammable and toxic. So we have to consider those facts as well. I mean, if we're talking about environmentalism and taking care of our surroundings, well, then how are we taking care of that waste? There are many questions that come up with that. There's also a factor of which companies, if we talk about corporatism or capitalism, if people have a negative view of that, well, there are many companies that are benefiting from pushing electric vehicles. There is a profit factor in that. This is not an altruistic endeavor. People are making, and I have no problems with that. I'm just saying if people have a black and white thinking and say, oh, fossil fuels is about greedy oil companies making money, whereas electric vehicles is altruism through and through. That's not true at all. And then there are also geopolitical considerations. I mean, which country dominates the mining of rare earth minerals that go into making these batteries? Which country has the factories that make these batteries? That's China, definitely. And what does that say when we talk about energy transition, when we talk about our standing in the world? There are many moving parts and factors to consider. And just having this idea that fossil fuels are bad and electric vehicles are good, or internal combustion engine is bad and electric vehicles are good, that's reductive, and that also prevents us from addressing the real concerns that arise when we are taking this seriously, this transition seriously, and it also prevents us from addressing the problems that are within this electric vehicle sector and the companies that do business, the countries that do business in this sector.
So one of the questions we always ask, and we ask it along with you today, and Meg in particular, what's the best way to create prosperity so that we have the resources to address as many of those goals as we can, as well as we can? And usually it requires economic growth. And if we're going to have economic growth over the long term, we have to give people economic freedom. Meg, keep us going.
I'd like to share an example of how human civilization naturally switched to a more eco-friendly form of energy. Whaling was a huge industry a couple of centuries ago because whale oil was used for all sorts of, as a fuel source. And so we saw, whales become endangered. And of course that's awful. You don't want to do that. But the reason why whaling stopped and we stopped using whale oil was because vegetable oil was developed. I'm not talking about running cars. I'm talking about the comparable use of the oils that were obtained from whaling and then vegetable oil. And as we know, vegetable oil doesn't involve killing any animals, and it's, as I said, cheap, reliable, and abundant. And everybody just made the transition on their own. It's not that people had to be convinced to stop killing the whales. I don't see human beings as inherently evil, looking to be exploitative or looking to hurt the environment and others that share planet Earth with us. I just think people are trying to do the best that we can with the resources that we have, and when we get a better option, we go for that. And so if electric vehicles really were a better option than what we have right now as the dominant technology, everybody would automatically move to that. It would be a smooth transition. You wouldn't have to ban things or mandate things. So allowing that sector, I really think that giving subsidies hurts that sector. You need to be able to allow that sector to evolve. And we're really smart when it comes to technology. We're in the 21st century. We can do all sorts of things. So why can't we get this right? We can. But what happens is when you know that money is coming in, you know that it's a favored sector, that messes up the incentives to do well and to grow. If you have to actually compete in the market, that's a different incentive. That's a different driving factor, and that will change things and allow companies to find new ways to actually compete with internal combustion engines, which is what we want. So competition, as you said, that is a very powerful motivator. Actually trying to make money and make a profit, which is not greed, but which is trying to find compensation for the talent and hard work and time that you put into developing something. I think these are really powerful motivators. They've been proven to be so, not only psychologically, but economically in the market. So if people who really want to move away from internal combustion engines, mandates or diktats, that's not the way to go. I would say a real solution would be to support the industry where it is right now, not hope that in 13 years or 14 years it will be perfect. No, we don't know that. But allow it, as I said, allow it the time, allow it the space, and allow it to fail. Allow it to fail and grow and learn instead of propping it up and thereby really ruining its chances of actually becoming something successful and transformative and bringing our society to the next level.
Good insights indeed.
What we really need to do is help the average Vermonter, the average American, become richer, not poorer. And whatever technologies allow that to happen, we should support that. Now, that's not to say that we should pollute the whole place. As you said, Bill, technology, fossil fuel-driven technology, has helped minimize pollution because, we're not talking about Victorian England with the smoke-filled factories. We're not looking at 1950s LA with the tailpipe emissions. We live in a cleaner, more eco-friendly world because of the technologies that we have, thanks to the abundant, reliable, and cheap sources of fossil fuel energy that drive modern civilization.